Buenos días, me hablo Nick Santilli e io sono un estudiante nella classe della professoressa Christian Bermudez in Spanish 101. This is my presentation for the Multimedia Project, the final project, and I will be discussing verbs, especially in the present tense. Verbs are basically words that we are all familiar with and we use every single day, probably the most that we use. And of course, verbs describe either an action or a state of being. An action would be, I throw the ball. A state of being is, I am tired or I am hungry. Now, in Spanish, like all the Romance languages, verbs can be a bit complicated. Anybody who studied Latin or other languages will know this. Spanish is basically, and the only way you will know to use the verbs correctly is to really study them and to either memorize them or get a good understanding of it. But what tends to happen is that you also begin to understand verbs in English because we never really think about it. But anyway, here we go. In Spanish, you have regular verbs, irregular verbs, stem-changing verbs, and a whole slew of others. The pluperfect, the perfect, and God knows what else. I know when we studied Latin, this was drummed into us, and it took a while. Anyway, in irregular verbs, these are verbs that do not follow the regular rules and have a unique conjugation structures. For example, verbs like ser, estar, venir, et tenir. We don't have to discuss them too much because, like in yo soy, tú estás, ella es. Notice the changes of the way the verb relates to the pronoun. And so these words, they're usually very crucial words. They're essential words like I am, I have, yo tengo, things like that. And they do have unique structures. The other set are regular verbs. These are verbs which follow standard forms of conjugation. And typically in Spanish, there are three ending types. You have verbs that end in AR, as in cocinar, to cook. Regular verbs that end in ER, beber is an example, to drink. And finally, verbs ending in IR, partir, to leave. Okay? And they do have basically all the same structure and grammatical rules, and in many ways are easier. Once you know that they're regular verbs, you know pretty much how to conjugate the present tense. For example, in cocinar, you have the stem cocin with the ending that changes depending on the pronoun. So, yo cocino, tú cocinas, ella cocina, nosotros cocinamos, ellos cocinan. I cook, you cook, he cooks, we cook, you cook, they cook. As you can see, in English, it's a lot simpler. And the verbs ending in ER, you have, for example, in beber, It follows pretty much the same structure. For example, yo bebo, tú bebe, él bebe. Nosotros bebemos, ellos beben. I drink, you drink, he drinks, we drink, you drink, they drink. Again, fairly simple in English. In Spanish, the IR verbs also, you have examples of partir. I leave, you leave, he leaves, we leave, you leave, they leave. Very simple in English. In Spanish is yo parto, tú parte, él parte. Nosotros partimos, ellos parten. So as you can see, these follow regular structural grammatical rules. And for the most part, just studying them, you understand that they are simpler than other types of verbs, the irregular verbs. But it's important to know the irregular verbs, very, very importantly to know them, because those are the more fundamental verbs, like I am, you know, you have. These are very fundamental action, state of being words. Then comes what I think is a pain in the cuello. It's the stem changing verbs. These are verbs that have endings as regular verbs, just like the three AR, ER, and IR. But undergo the spelling changes in the radical of some of the conjugations. And this is where it gets a little interesting. Basically, the stem changing verbs in Spanish are verbs that when we conjugate them in the simple tense, there's a vowel change in the last syllable of the stem. And this is why it's a stem still word. And again, to use the examples, in Spanish there are 5 types of stem changing situations. You have when the verb stem, the vowel changes from E. When you have an E, it changes to an IE. Yeah. The second one is the verb, the verb ends in an O, it has an O, and the verb, the stem will change to UE. There's another one with an E that changes to an I, and a U that changes to a UE, and an I that changes to an IE. So these are fairly standard, but again, complicated. There are plenty of various YouTube and internet sites and apps that will explain this in very thorough detail. The other one, for example, the stem change I to IE. I'm sorry, E to IE. This means this is probably the most common of all the stem changing verbs from what I saw. Examples are to want, querer, yo quiero, to lose, to understand, entender, where it becomes to entendies, to begin, comenzar, comenzar, which becomes ella, for example, comienza, comienza. So the E goes to IE. To close, cerrar, cerrar, will change to, for example, yo cierro, cierro, the IE again. And again, these are rules that you just have to learn. There's another change in the second one is the O to OUE. And this stem category, for example, the O, the stem is an O that is replaced by the diphthong UE. So in this examples of this would be to move, mover is mover to yo muevo. To rain, llover, llueve, llueve. Volver, to return. Volver becomes ellos vuelven, I'm sorry. So again, the UE. It's kind of a tough one for me. The other one is the stem change that goes from E to IE. And this is, again, a little more complicated because it prescribes that if the stem contains the vowel E in the last stressed syllable, then it must be changed to an I. This is where it gets complex. And it only applies to verbs ending in IR. For example, edir, pedir, impedir, eguir, conseguir, perseguir, seguir. Verbs ending in enir, like ceñir or reñir. An example. To obtain, conseguir becomes yo consigo. To follow, seguir, yo sigo. To row, reñir, yo riño. And again, this is fairly, I would suggest that you have to study this more than anything else. I mean, it's just, you just have to require studying and practice. But I think it's very important that, and again, the other one becomes the stem changes the U to UE, which is the fourth stem change type. And this is kind of funky because there's only one of them. It's the verb jogar, to play. And it's an anomaly. I mean, it's just a freak, a freak verb, so to speak. It is the only one that goes from U to UE. It's interesting because it should have been jogar, but it changed. You know, languages are funny that way. They are funny that way. Languages are living things that change with the times, and the rules change. The last one is the stem change I to IE. There's only, and again, this is another one with only two examples. Adquirir, which is to acquire, and inquirir, which means to inquire. The rule is kind of straight. You drop the I and you substitute it with IE. So for example, in the word adquirir, to buy, adquirir would be yo adquiro, adquiro, and so on. So it's kind of simple. There's only two of them. But again, this shows you the, and in conclusion, to discuss this, you see the language itself is a living thing, and how verbs are a very crucial part of the language, and how stem changes, for example, change with the type of word that you're dealing with, and again, the types of verbs. Then got their regular, and that makes it a little simpler. So I would suggest that in order to understand verbs is very crucial in understanding Spanish. It really is. I mean, I came to America when I studied English, and I wish it would have been a little different in the way they taught language to me. and it was kind of different, so it was hit or miss. But knowing Latin and Italian really made a huge difference in understanding, because much of the language does come from Latin. Is the mother tongue. Latin is a beautiful, wonderful, gorgeous language that is very important, and it's really not dead, even though nobody speaks it except in the Vatican and the Catholic Church. But basically, it is a very, very important language, and it's still alive. And I would suggest to people to really try to understand. If you want to understand Spanish, give Latin a little bit of a look. But in this case, you really have to practice. Practice is crucial. And in understanding verbs, you begin to understand the structure of the language. It's work, but it's well worth it, because you will become a much better speaker as time goes on, and a much better proponent of the Spanish language. I thank you very much. Muy gracias. It's been a wonderful class. I really enjoyed it. The only regret is that I wish I would have been not online, but in a class with my classmates. There were some classmates that had wonderful comments, and I thank Profesora Bermudez to basically guide the class online. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Buenas tardes.